With me this morning to preview Mr Hockey's budget, we've got Labor frontbencher Brendan O'Connor and Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
Morning.
Steve Ciobo, first to you on the issue of the broken promises. Are we getting back to the area of core and non-core promises? It certainly sounds like it.
No, not at all. I mean, we made a clear commitment to the Australian people, and I believe we've got a clear mandate from the Australian people to do several things. Stop the boats. We're stopping the boats. To get rid of the carbon and mining taxes, we're trying to do that. The Labor Party's stopping us. We said we're going to build the roads of the 21st century, and we are absolutely committed to doing that, and there'll be more detail tonight, as well as obviously statements that have been made over the recent times. And the most fundamental of all was to restore Australia's economic credibility and to put us back onto a pathway of financial sustainability. And tonight's budget is all about putting us back on that pathway, making the tough decisions, demonstrating that Labor's magic pudding approach that says you can just keep spending as much money as you want and you never have to worry about it, that all comes to an end. We are now tonight making very strong decisions to put Australia back onto a level playing field, or I should say an even keel, when it comes to our finances.
Can the government argue, though, that it didn't know the true extent or the issues of the budget, given the Charter of Budget Honesty and the fact that we had the pre-election fiscal outlook, the full disclosure of,
absolutely, Kieran.
Of the numbers? How can you say that you didn't know the full extent?
The reason being because we saw a lot of fiddling when it came to the way in which Labor approached the budget. Now, the clearest example that I can give is under Labor's budget, we saw, for example, where the unemployment rate was forecast to be at 6.5%, and then miraculously overnight, after 2 years, just miraculously overnight, it suddenly dropped down to 5%. Now, what we did is that we changed the parameters so we made it realistic. And so what we actually then saw was a true state of the books, a much better reflection of the problems that Australia faced. In addition, Kieran, take for example Labor's approach on border protection. Now, we know there are over 700 boats, over 50,000 people. Labor only funded it until the 1st of January. They had no additional funding there actually on the books from the 1st of January. So again, we saw all of these sort of spiders in the closet, as the Treasurer was referring to it. So we now have a clear, accurate picture of where it was. That's the reason why we've got to make the tough decisions we're making tonight.
Brendan O'Connor, do you think the Australian people are yearning for basically a focus on the big picture, on this issue of getting the budget back on track? This is what the government's saying it wants to do, rather than getting caught up in the various other points. That's the key issue here, isn't it?
Well, they're expecting a government to do what it said it would do. A government, a Prime Minister who said there'd be no surprises, no excuses. There's been a suite of surprises and a litany of lies when it comes to what the government has chosen to do, it would appear. And we'll hear more on that tonight. But you look at what's happening here. Low and middle income earners are going to be slugged. It doesn't matter if you're taking your kid to a doctor. In fact, if you're getting petrol on the way to the doctor, you get taxed twice, it would appear, as a result of the statements that have already been made by the Treasurer. You have taxes imposed on people who at least can afford it. You've got a government that's not focused on jobs. You've got a government that actually has goaded companies to leave our shores. I mean, it's quite the height of the Treasurer to talk about his concerns about workforce participation. Workforce participation has fallen under this government since it was elected, and indeed we've got huge companies either leaving Australia or indeed in the case of Qantas shedding thousands of jobs. On top of that, you're going to have a budget that's going to slash jobs, cut services and impose taxes. That means that will dampen private consumption. It will cut public consumption.
But it's going to be accompanied by a big spend on infrastructure, and that is obviously going to boost job creation, isn't it?
Maybe over the longer term. What, by imposing a petrol tax on motorists? I mean, the
tax is already there. It's returning indexation.
It's increasing taxes, something that unequivocally the Prime Minister said he would not do. He said you do not grow the economy by imposing taxes. You don't tax your way to prosperity, I think his words were. He was not going to introduce new taxes other than the tax he was imposing on corporations for the parental leave scheme, which again shows how the priorities of this government are totally wrong.
Well, those words are correct, aren't they? That is exactly what the Prime Minister said. In terms of that promise, there'd be no... He said we will reduce taxes without increasing others. That was the promise.
You know, Kieran,
how do you get around that?
Well, I'd take Labor a little bit more seriously if they were that concerned about the levels of taxation. If they actually respected the fact that we have a clear mandate to abolish the carbon tax and the mining tax. I mean, how can Labor say that they're so concerned about taxation, yet they are actually standing in the way of the clear will of the Australian people when we are trying to abolish two taxes that make our nation
Will you be arguing, is this a fair assessment, that the Treasurer tonight will be saying that the overall burden will be lower and try and get around the backlash, the political fallout like that?
Tonight Australians will see the detail of the budget, but I am very confident, and Australians should be confident in the Coalition, that there will be lower levels of taxation under the Coalition than there would be under Labor. We are trying to abolish the world's biggest carbon tax. We're trying to abolish the mining tax. Both of these taxes are job-destroying taxes. Labor stands in the way, and yet Labor, in the absolute height of hypocrisy, then says, oh, no, well, we don't want to see any increases in our highest marginal tax rates, for example, if there is a deficit levy, and we don't want to see the re-indexation of fuel excise, even though it was the Labor Party that took us from having a $20 billion surplus and no debt to actually being on a pathway to having $123 billion worth of deficits, and a pathway that would see us reach $667 billion of debt.
I want to play, I'll come back to Brendan O'Connor in just a moment. I just want to play for our viewers a little bit of what Tony Abbott said. He was on the Alan Jones program on Radio 2GB this morning and said that the gold pass for politicians' travel is going to be scrapped. Let's have a listen.
I don't want people to say, oh, those blokes in Canberra are making me suffer while they get off scot-free. So there will be a deficit levy on high-income earners. The lifetime gold pass for politicians, gone, finished, kaput, dead, finally.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
And yes, there will be a pay freeze for politicians, judges and senior public servants.
Now, the Prime Minister's also indicated that he, along with other politicians, will be copping it as far as the debt levy goes, to the tune of $6,500 for the PM. Let's have a listen.
The debt tax will cost you about, what, 6,000?
About 6,500.
And the backbench about 4,000?
It's everyone is going to be in this.
Yeah.
We're all in it together. And what I don't want, Alan, is for a pensioner to be able to look me in the eye and say, I'm bearing pain and you're not.
The Prime Minister speaking on Radio 2GB this morning. Brendan O'Connor, first of all, on the gold pass for unlimited travel, do you think that that's a good move to get rid of that, to show that politicians are also taking a bit of a haircut here?
Well, the previous government started to cut those entitlements, and I think quite rightly so. I think it's been shown that people have misused that entitlement, former members of parliament, in that they've used it for the wrong purposes. I think there can be some justification for some of those things if they're used for a public purpose. So I have no problems with the government moving in that area. Again, of course, it was this Prime Minister in 2008 who complained that he had a mortgage to pay when the then Prime Minister had introduced a freeze on politicians' pay. I have no great concern about that. Our focus today should be on low and middle income earners who are going to be slugged by this government in a way that is dishonest, because it was nothing like what was being proposed before the election. That's my
But does Labor need to show that it is willing to cooperate in some of these areas and allow some of the measures through?
That's why we will look at the budget in detail. But let's be clear here, this is a contrived crisis. No independent economic observer has suggested that our economy was anything but strong. I sat around the table, the G20 in Moscow, as the employment minister in the last months of the previous government, and no serious G20 politician was saying anything other than we did very well through the global financial crisis, low debt as a ratio to GDP, low unemployment relatively speaking. It's not to say we didn't have issues, and we do have to ensure that we consolidate fiscally, no doubt about that. But this is a contrived crisis to allow this government to attack ideologically low and middle income earners unnecessarily.
Let's get Steve Ciobo's response to that assertion there.
Well, I mean, I think any Australian, any reasonable Australian that's listening would recognise that tough decisions we don't do because we think they're going to be popular. We make tough decisions because they're in the long-term national interest of Australia. We have to shift from being a budget that's focused on consumption to being a budget that's about investment for the future. Labor's approach, which just is to ignore the problem and keep repeating the mantra, there's no problem, we can just keep doing what we're doing, there's no issue here. That's a failed approach, Kieran. That's the kind of approach that saw us run up the kind of debt incidentally, the IMF report or the World Bank released a report that showed that the increase in debt in Australia was the fastest out of all of the developed economies. That's what happened in Australia. So I think the reality is that Labor's track record really speaks volumes.
But is it really a short-term crisis? It's more of a medium to longer-term trajectory, isn't it? That's the concern.
Well, Kieran, we saw under the Labor Party budget deficits in the order of $40 billion, $50 billion. If Australians really think that it's okay for a government to keep running up budget deficits of $40 or $50 billion, if Australians really think that it's okay for us to be paying over $1 billion a month in interest payments, well, then they should support Labor.
Okay, in terms of the budget tonight, you're the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, you're pretty much in tune with what we can expect tonight. Should we anticipate more nasties, or is all the bad news out there?
All the detail will be in the budget, so people should tune in. I mean, what else would you do on a Tuesday night? So they should tune in, get all the details of the budget. But in a more serious vein, Kieran, tonight's budget will put Australia back on a pathway to economic sustainability. Full stop. That's the bottom line. It's about making the tough calls that need to be made.
Tough politically, though, isn't it? Because as you heard from Brendan O'Connor, and this will be ceaseless until the next election, that this is a document that does have a number of broken promises in it.
Kieran, there's no surprises that when we're making tough decisions that are tough politically, that we know that the electorate all aspects of the electorate don't love all aspects of the budget. We know the Labor Party's going to be out there trying to make hay and say, oh no, it'll all be different under us.
Just use your words
but it's unsustainable.
to make that clear.
Simple.
Well, just look at the words that were said before the election and after the election. A fundamental breach of faith with the Australian people, and the Prime Minister will have to wear that.
All right, let's take a break on AM Agenda. Back in just a moment. Stay with us. This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. News conference with Bill Shorten in just a moment. First though to Steve Ciobo and Brendan O'Connor. Steve Ciobo reports this morning the government's going to look at bonus payments, $10,000 for employers for older Australians, or not that old, over 50.
Sure.
But I suppose if you're going to lift the retirement age, you need to give people encouragement that they're going to get a job.
Well, Kieran, might surprise you, I'm not going to confirm or deny what will be taking place in a matter of 12 hours or thereabouts.
Sure.
But what I will say is this, is that we are committed to making sure that we get the labour force active. We're committed to making sure we get people to contribute to the Australian society, because we think that there's a lot of benefit that flows from people having a job. And if we can help to provide some incentive, if we can help to drive down unemployment, then we want to do that. And we've had success in the past. We got, when the coalition was last in power, unemployment down to a 30-year record low. It rose by 200,000 under the Labor Party. We saw unemployment shoot back up, but we're committed to getting it back down.
All right, finally, Brendan O'Connor, to you, and any final thoughts ahead of the
Well, we hope there is something there for workers. We know that if you're in your 40s now, you're worried about having to wait till you're 70, and that's really hard for nurses and bricklayers and people who have got physical duties. So we hope that there is something for workers, but I have to say, on the track of the government to date, we wouldn't be holding our breath.
Gentlemen, thanks so much for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks,